The phone rang before dawn, breaking the heavy silence of the early morning. Anne, still drowsy, reached out to answer, her eyes half closed from the dim light of the bedside lamp. "Anne, you need to come now." The voice on the other end was Jon Carter's, but it sounded different. Shaky, filled with urgency, almost unrecognizable. "Something happened in the barn last night. Simba is acting strangely. I can't explain." Anne felt a chill run down her spine. Jon wasn't the type to get scared easily, and the fact that he mentioned Simba, the imposing Boerboel of the farm, made her even more curious. Simba was known for his courage and protective instinct, but something seemed to have shaken even the brave dog. Without hesitating, she put on a coat, grabbed her veterinary kit, and headed towards the farm. As she crossed the gates, Simba came running to meet her, but unlike other times, he wasn't happy or confident. The dog was restless, his eyes fixed on the distant barn, letting out a low growl. Anne looked at the barn, its dark silhouette against the brightening sky. If Simba was acting this way, something truly strange was happening. Before continuing, just take a quick look to check if you're already subscribed to the channel. If you like dogs and their stories, you won't want to miss any videos. The farm, located in the heart of the South African savanna, was surrounded by a silent, golden landscape. The main house, with its rustic and isolated structure, seemed to have been sculpted by time, with worn wooden walls and a porch that creaked at the slightest movement. The air was dry, filled with the smell of earth and grass, and the silence was so profound that any sound seemed to echo for miles. The barn, however, was the most striking feature. Weathered, with boards that creaked in the wind, it seemed to carry an invisible weight. Its slightly warped doors gave the impression that they hid something that did not want to be discovered. During the day, it was just an old building, but at night, under the moonlight, its presence became almost oppressive, as if it held secrets that no one dared to uncover. Simba, the imposing Boerboel of the farm, was a dog that exuded strength and confidence, but something about the barn made him uneasy. Whenever he approached, he would stop, growl softly, and back away, refusing to enter. His behavior was so unusual that even Jon, accustomed to the dog's courage, began to notice. Simba avoided the barn at all costs, as if he knew something that humans couldn't perceive. The local villagers also seemed to know more than they let on. Whenever Jon passed through the village, suspicious glances followed him. They avoided talking about the property, and when the subject came up, they quickly changed the conversation. It was as if there was a silent pact not to mention what happened there. Thank you for leaving your like on this video. Since his arrival at the farm, Jon Carter began to notice things that didn't make sense. On the first night, while trying to sleep, he heard footsteps on the roof. They weren't just creaks from the old wood, but something that sounded like firm steps coming and going. He got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went up to check. Nothing. Just the silence of the early morning and the distant sound of the wind. He tried to convince himself it was just the effect of fatigue, but the discomfort remained. As the days went by, other events began to occur. Doors that used to stay closed started to creak and open on their own, even when there was no wind. Sometimes Jon heard soft knocks, almost as if someone was trying to get his attention. The sound seemed to come from inside the barn. He investigated but never found anything except shadows and the strong smell of hay. With each visit to the barn, the feeling that something was out of place grew. Simba, the faithful Boerboel, also began to act strangely. Normally calm and vigilant, the dog now spent much of his time growling toward the barn. He refused to enter, even when Jon called him. Instead, he stood at the entrance, his body tense and his eyes fixed on an invisible point. At night, Simba barked aggressively, as if trying to ward off something Jon couldn't see. It was as if the dog was trying to warn him of a danger that only he could sense. Jon tried to ignore the signs. He attributed the sounds and Simba's behavior to isolation and stress. After all, he was in a remote place, far from everything and everyone. But even trying to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. It was as if, with every step he took, there were invisible eyes following his movements. One night, while closing the windows of the house, Jon saw something out of the corner of his eye. A quick shadow passing near the barn. He froze for a moment, trying to understand what he had seen. He grabbed his flashlight and went out to investigate, but as always, he found nothing. Just the silence of the night and the cold glow of the moon over the landscape. Still, he felt he was not alone. The signs were there, increasingly clear. Something was happening on the farm, something he couldn't explain, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he knew he couldn't avoid it for much longer. It was an apparently ordinary night on the farm. Jon was in the home office, sitting in his wooden chair in front of his laptop. The cold light from the screen illuminated the room as he typed slowly, trying to organize his thoughts. The space was simple, with a clean desk and only the essentials: the laptop, a notepad, and a half-full coffee mug. The sound of the wind outside was the only interruption, and everything seemed calm, until Simba started barking non-stop. The sound came suddenly, loud and sharp, breaking the silence of the night. It wasn't a normal bark. It was fierce, urgent, as if the dog was trying to alert him to something. Jon stopped typing and looked out the office window, which faced the yard. Simba was out there, standing like a statue, his body tense and his eyes fixed on the barn. His barks echoed through the darkness, filled with an intensity Jon had never heard before. But as abruptly as it started, the barking stopped. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. Jon felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. That's when he heard it. 3 firm knocks on the front door. They weren't soft, but they weren't violent either. They had a spaced rhythm, as if someone was waiting patiently. Jon froze for a moment, his heart racing. Who could be there at that hour, so far from any neighborhood? He stood up slowly, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor as he walked down the hallway. He took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. When he opened it, he found only emptiness. The night was dark, the wind seemed to have stopped, and there was no one there. The silence that filled the house was almost unbearable. The air seemed heavier, charged with something Jon couldn't explain. He called for Simba, but the dog didn't respond. He looked out the window again, but Simba had disappeared. The yard was empty, and the dog's absence increased his unease even more. Where could he have gone? Minutes later, Simba reappeared. He came running from the field, but something was different. The dog was restless, his fur bristling and his eyes fixed on the barn. He wasn't barking, but growling low, as if trying to warn Jon not to approach. It was as if Simba knew something Jon couldn't yet understand. The tension on the farm was almost palpable. Jon felt as if the very environment around him was changing, as if something invisible was moving in the shadows. He tried to push the thoughts away, but the feeling that something was about to happen was impossible to ignore. The barn, with its dark and silent presence, seemed to beckon him, like a secret waiting to be revealed. Jon knew, deep down, that this night would mark a before and after. The sun was still low on the horizon when Jon decided he could no longer ignore the barn. The unease from the previous night consumed him, and he felt he needed to understand what was happening. Simba, however, seemed suspicious. The dog remained on the porch, watching the barn with a fixed and restless gaze. Jon tried to call him, but Simba didn't move. Determined, he grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the weathered wooden structure. As he opened the barn door, Jon was greeted by a strong smell of aged wood and damp earth. Daylight filtered through small cracks in the boards, creating beams that illuminated the dark interior. The place seemed empty, but there was a heavy atmosphere, as if the space held long-forgotten secrets. He took a few hesitant steps, the sound of his boots echoing on the hard-packed dirt floor. It was then that Simba, who had finally decided to follow him, began to sniff the ground intensely. Suddenly, the dog stopped at a specific spot and began to dig frantically. Jon watched for a moment, intrigued by Simba's behavior. Something was buried there. He looked around, trying to understand what it could be, but curiosity quickly won out. Without hesitation, Jon left the barn, grabbed a shovel leaning against the outer wall, and returned to where Simba was digging. With the shovel in hand, he began to dig next to the dog. With each strike into the earth, the tension seemed to increase. It didn't take long for Jon to hit something hard. He stopped, took a deep breath, and cleared the dirt around the object. It was an old, rusted box with hinges that seemed ready to fall apart. Carefully, he removed it from the hole and opened it. Inside the box was a grotesque voodoo doll made of straw and fabric, with pins stuck in various parts of its body. The doll's eyes, made of black beads, seemed to stare at him in a disturbing way. Jon felt a chill run down his spine. But before he could process what he had just found, Simba started growling and digging again, even more frantically. Something else was buried there. Jon continued to dig, now with more force, his heart racing. After a few minutes, he found something that made him hold his breath. Human bones. They were arranged haphazardly, as if they had been buried in haste. The air inside the barn seemed to grow heavier, and a sense of discomfort overcame Jon. It was as if something invisible was there, watching his every move, something that was not happy with the discovery. He stood up quickly, his heart pounding, and looked around. The barn seemed darker, more oppressive. Simba was by his side, his fur bristling and a low growl that wouldn't stop. Jon knew he had awakened something that was buried not just in the ground, but in the very past of that place. The feeling of dread was almost unbearable, and he felt as if the very air around him was charged with an invisible presence. With the box and the bones still on the ground, Jon left the barn, his heart heavy and his mind flooded with questions. Who had buried that there? And more importantly, what did it mean? He knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. Something had been awakened, and he had no idea what was to come. The following morning, after the discovery in the barn, Jon felt uneasy. He had barely slept, and the memory of the bones and the voodoo doll still weighed heavily on his mind. As he drank his coffee on the porch, Simba, who seemed calmer, started growling again. Jon followed the dog's gaze and noticed something that made him freeze. There was a man standing at the property's gate. The stranger was motionless, with his hands in his pockets, watching the house in complete silence. He wore simple clothes and a hat that partially hid his face. Jon stood up, trying to understand who this unexpected visitor was. "Can I help you?" he shouted, but the man did not respond. Instead, he slowly turned around and began to walk away, heading toward the dirt road that led out of the farm. Jon stood still for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Who was that man? And why was he there, just watching? He decided not to give it too much importance, thinking it could just be someone lost or curious. But the next day, the pattern repeated. Early in the morning, while Jon was checking the barn, Simba started barking again. When Jon went out to see what was happening, there was the man, standing in the same spot at the gate. This time, Jon tried to approach him. He walked with firm steps toward the gate, but just like the day before, the stranger walked away before Jon could reach him. It was as if he wanted to be seen, but not confronted. Jon's unease grew. He knew this was no coincidence. When Anne arrived at the farm later that day, he told her about the mysterious visitor. Anne, always practical and straightforward, furrowed her brow as she listened to the story. "This doesn't seem right, Jon. Someone just standing there watching like that? We need to find out who this person is and what they want." Anne decided she would stay at the farm for a few days. "If he shows up again, we'll confront him together," she said, determinedly. Jon felt a little more relieved with her presence, but the feeling that something strange was happening did not leave him. He knew the man at the gate was not just a curious onlooker. There was more to his silent presence, and Jon feared it was connected to what he had found in the barn. The next morning, the mysterious man appeared at the gate again. This time, Jon and Anne, already prepared, decided to approach him together. Simba, always alert, growled softly, as if sensing that something was wrong. Both walked firmly toward the stranger, who, as before, remained motionless, watching them. When they were close enough, Jon tried to speak first. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" His voice was firm, but the man did not react. He merely shifted his gaze to Anne, as if Jon wasn't there. Then, to their surprise, he began to speak. But his words were not clear to Jon. It was a local dialect, something ancient that Jon couldn't understand. Anne, however, seemed to understand every word. The conversation was brief. The man spoke calmly, but there was something unsettling in his tone. Anne, visibly uncomfortable, merely nodded. After a few minutes, the man took a step back, turned around, and walked slowly away, disappearing down the dirt road. Jon looked at Anne, waiting for an explanation. "What did he say? Who is he?" he asked anxiously. Anne, still perplexed, took a few seconds to respond. He asked us to bury the box you found in the barn. He said it needs to be taken to the mountains and buried there, far from here." Jon was silent for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. "But how does he know about the box? We didn't tell anyone." His voice was filled with disbelief. Anne shook her head, equally confused. "I don't know, Jon. He didn't explain. He just said it's dangerous to keep it here and that we need to get rid of it as soon as possible." Jon's mind was racing. How did that man know about the box? And why did he speak only to Anne? Nothing made sense. The stranger's request only deepened the mystery surrounding the farm. Jon knew that somehow everything was connected. The barn, the bones, the voodoo doll, and now, the man at the gate. But the answers seemed more elusive than ever, leaving a sense of impending danger in the air. Anne and Jon knew they couldn't ignore the mysterious man's request. Something in the way he had spoken, the almost urgent tone, convinced them that the box needed to be removed from the farm. Even without fully understanding the reason, they decided to follow the instructions. Jon prepared the truck, while Anne carefully packed the box, as if she feared something might escape from it. Simba, always attentive, seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. He positioned himself beside Jon, ready to accompany them. The road to the mountains was long and winding, surrounded by tall trees that blocked the sunlight. The silence of the place was interrupted only by the sound of the tires on the dirt and the wind that began to blow unusually. As they advanced, the feeling of being watched increased. Jon looked in the rearview mirror constantly, but saw nothing but the empty road. Anne, in the passenger seat, held the box tightly, as if she feared it might disappear from her hands. When they finally parked the truck and began to walk on the steep terrain, the inexplicable events began. The wind, which had been just a breeze, became strong and cutting, almost as if it were trying to push them back. Strange sounds echoed through the surrounding forest, distant screams, breaking branches, and something that sounded like the growl of an animal, but which neither of them could identify. Simba, normally brave, was restless. He stopped every few steps, sniffing the air and staring intently at points in the darkness between the trees. "Do you feel that?" Jon asked, trying to stay calm. Anne just shook her head, saying nothing. There was something in the air, an invisible presence that accompanied them. Each step seemed heavier, as if the ground itself resisted their passage. Simba, however, kept moving forward, as if he knew exactly where they were going. After hours of walking, they reached a clearing that seemed different from the rest of the forest. The wind there was even stronger, and the strange sounds seemed to come from all directions. Anne pointed to a specific spot on the ground. "It's here," she said, with a certainty Jon did not understand. He began to dig while Anne and Simba remained alert, watching their surroundings. When the hole was deep enough, Jon placed the box inside and began to cover it with dirt. As soon as the last shovel of dirt was placed, something changed. The wind abruptly ceased, and the strange sounds disappeared, leaving only the absolute silence of the forest. Jon and Anne looked at each other, not knowing what to think. Simba, for his part, seemed calmer, but still kept his gaze fixed on the darkness around them. Despite having completed the task, the feeling of unease did not leave them. It was as if, although they had buried the box, something was still present, watching them. Jon looked at Anne, trying to find some comfort in her eyes, but she seemed as confused as he was. "Let's go back," she finally said, and the three of them began to descend the mountain. As they walked back to the truck, Jon couldn't help but wonder if they had really solved the problem or just awakened something even more dangerous. The forest was now silent, but the silence was not comforting. It was the kind of silence that seemed to hide secrets, secrets that they might never be able to understand. When Jon, Anne, and Simba returned to the farm, the place seemed quieter than ever. The wind that had previously blown in an unsettling manner was now calm, and the disturbing sounds that had accompanied them in the forest had disappeared. However, the silence brought no relief. It was a heavy kind of silence, as if something invisible still hovered over them. Anne tried to act as if everything was normal. She organized the house, checked the surroundings, and tried to distract Simba, who still seemed suspicious, sniffing the air as if searching for something only he could sense. Jon, on the other hand, was deeply shaken. He wandered aimlessly around the property, avoiding the barn and the places that used to bring him comfort. Now, every corner of the farm seemed filled with memories he didn't want to revisit. The experience in the mountains had left its mark. Jon couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious man, the box, and why all of that had happened. He wondered if they had really ended the mystery or just temporarily pushed the danger away. Every night, he woke up disturbed, as if something was watching him, even in the dark. Anne noticed that Jon had changed. He, who had always been strong and decisive, now seemed lost in his own thoughts. "Are you okay?" she asked one morning. But Jon just shook his head, unable to answer. The truth was, he didn't know how to move forward after everything they had been through. The emotional tension was evident. Jon avoided talking about what had happened, but the weight of the experience was written all over his face. He knew that something inside him had changed forever. The farm, which had once been his refuge, now seemed like a strange place, filled with secrets he would never fully unravel. In the end, Jon made a decision. He needed to get away, leave the farm behind, and try to find peace elsewhere. Anne, understanding the depth of his suffering, did not try to stop him. When Jon left, he took with him only the hope that, with time, the memories would become less intense. But deep down, he knew that some things would never be forgotten. Weeks had passed since Jon left the farm. He tried to move on, but the memories of the events still haunted him. It was as if the pieces of the puzzle remained scattered, not forming a clear image. Then, one quiet morning, he received a message from Anne. Her words were brief but filled with meaning. "I discovered something about the barn. It was built over an ancient cemetery of a local tribe." Jon read the message several times, trying to absorb what it meant. Anne explained that while investigating the property's history, she found old records mentioning the tribe that inhabited the region centuries ago. The box, the bones, and even the voodoo doll were likely part of rituals performed by the tribe. It was possible that, by being disturbed, these elements triggered the supernatural events they experienced. The revelation brought answers, but also raised new questions. Why was the box hidden in the barn? Who put it there? And the mysterious Man, how did he know about all this? Jon realized that, although some pieces had fallen into place, the complete mystery might never be fully unraveled. Reflecting on everything that happened, Jon felt a mix of fascination and fear. He had always believed that reality was predictable, governed by clear rules. But his experience on the farm showed him that the world is much more complex and strange than he imagined. Reality, he thought, can be more frightening than any story I could invent. Although he still carried the weight of what he had experienced, Jon found a new perspective. He realized that not everything needs to be explained to be understood. Sometimes life's mysteries serve to remind us that there are forces beyond our comprehension, forces that deserve respect. And with that, Jon decided that, even if he never returned to the farm, that experience would stay with him as a reminder that the unknown is as fascinating as it is frightening. Weeks after the events at the farm, Jon was trying to get his life back on track, but the mystery still haunted him. One day, he received a call from Anne, who sounded nervous, almost hesitant. "Jon, Mr. Van Rensburg contacted me," she said, referring to the enigmatic owner of the farm. "He explained something about the barn, and I think you need to know." Anne recounted that Van Rensburg, always reserved, finally decided to share a secret he had carried for years. He revealed that the barn had been built over an ancient cemetery of a local tribe. According to him, the land was considered sacred, and the site was used for rituals that connected the living to the spirits of their ancestors. The box and the bones found by Jon were part of these rituals, objects that should never have been disturbed. Jon listened in silence, feeling a chill as Anne's words echoed in his mind. Everything began to make sense. The supernatural events, the mysterious man, and even the sense of unease that never left them. It was as if, by finding the box, they had awakened something that should have remained dormant. Van Rensburg explained that he knew the history, but never had the courage to deal with what was buried there. When Jon found the box, he realized that the balance had been disrupted. "That's why the man appeared," Anne concluded. "He knew the box needed to be returned to the earth, far from the desecrated place." Jon reflected deeply on everything he had experienced. He had always believed that the world was simple, governed by logic and reason. But now, he understood that reality can be much stranger and more frightening than any story he could imagine. He realized there are forces in the world that cannot be controlled, only respected. Now imagine, amidst the chaotic traffic of New York City, a Dogo Argentino suddenly appears and blocks Fifth Avenue. With deafening barks, it alerts the police to a suspicious car. What was in the trunk left everyone shocked. Click now on the video appearing on your screen and discover the surprising outcome of this story that will challenge everything you believe about animal instinct. See you in the next video.